Hi everyone, welcome back. So, putting a little bit of risk assessment management into your project management plans is always one of the key essential parts that any project manager is actually going to have to do throughout their career multiple times. And as you do these, you get more and more effective and create your own models for assessing information in your organization and risks itself. I want to look at just identifying. I know a lot of you have never dealt with this or anything in projects itself. The essence of a risk is identifying, analyzing, and responding to a risk throughout the entire life of a project, not just while you're making your plan. This is a constant milestone assessment and looking back at your risk management plan inside your project to understand whether or not this is actually create a good model for business continuity. And we'll talk a little bit more on that. I know you guys haven't had this class, most of you, but business continuity is always the main goal of any project management assessment. Making sure everything flows through no matter what happens, and looking at risk and potential risks that could cause a stoppage or an overage in your contracts or anything that could actually ruin a contract, even worse. These impacts usually start right away in the selection process, and we have to think about whether or not and evaluate and come up with a system. I like doing weighting and taking all the risks and all the options and all the cost factors and weighting them to see what's the top factors, and I'll place that numeric value on, most of the time, a good quantitative analysis of it. But I'll use qualitative methods as well by talking to other project managers, talking to other team members that are looking at the projects and evaluating the risks inside of this, and having them categorize everything and weight it themselves. This helps you determine a lot of the scope and evaluating whether or not you can be effective. If there's too many risks involved with getting something done in a certain time, especially if you're working on a government contract, you have to assess those risks overall to make sure that you can meet the project scope. And that's one of the first things you want to think about in risk assessment. Can we actually do this? You need to identify and analyze every single little piece. Do we have enough workforce? Do we have enough hardware to support the project? Do we need to do too much upgrading in our software to be able to meet the demands of the project and the needs of and roles of each individual working on the plan? And that helps with developing the schedules and understanding whether or not the workflow schedule, the flow of the whole management of the project can be managed itself. That's a risk itself. If you can't implement the right amount of people into the schedule flow to get the job done, you're never going to be able to finish. The cost estimates are also something that you can do as an estimate. Most people think you need a direct number, but you don't. As you get experience inside of project management, you get a good feel for how project costs can escalate, and they do always escalate. You always want to build in slack or a buffer, as a lot of people will say, into cost estimates. I overestimate usually by 20% at least on every single aspect. I look for, in human capital, overtime. If we're running behind, you have to think about this. If you're working with unions, which I did before, union contracts are very specific about how much the labor can work, when, and how. If there is a job rule that needs to be accomplished but can't be done by the certain union job rule, you have to wait for the jobs to be done by the union regulated people only. That may cause a stop in the flow of information, which you have to kind of estimate those breaks in production and allow for that. And the way you do that is the amount of labor that you have times the potential earnings they have, adding 20% onto that, and an estimated idea of how long it could take for a break. Maybe you think of a week or 2 weeks. Can you survive this? This would be something in selecting the processes and understanding whether that project's actually a viable project to even look at. In doing this, you're also talking and working with your stakeholders, and it's strengthening the relationships with them before you even start. And this helps because if they are not willing to support you and sponsor you in this project, even though you think you can manage the risk, it should not be a project that you would select to work on for your organization. Assessments help in many different ways. One, they obviously anticipate problems that's just going to come down the line. Maybe it's a workforce problem. Maybe you're entering into snow season and your organization is in the north, in New Hampshire or Vermont, where snow comes in a quick fall for 6 to 7 months. You might have a workforce stoppage because they can't physically get to the workforce in January, and knowing this, you have to kind of assess that problem. Yet also is a way to look at negative actions, and you build this in your mission charter. I like to bring that up there. Again, we talked about leadership values and bringing those core values in there. This is a great way to help prevent negative behaviors and actions inside your workforce alone. Instilling those core values, looking at your people that you're selecting, are they going to follow the core values and the mission? This is something you can assess. It's a risk, and you can weight that. If you have one person that you know is prone to never being on time, falling behind schedule, showing up late to work, you can assess that person at a higher risk and weight that person into the team's measure and how effective the team will be to being timely. It also helps reduce redundancies and slack needs, because if you understand this, you can build more time in or less time into it. You can look for redundancies. If you're working with another team that's doing a similar project, you may be able to integrate their project into yours, so that there's not two aspects of the same thing going on in the same build in a company. This also helps reduce the cost inflammation. You can look at values such as this and determine, well, we'd like to do this contract now, but right now is a season when there is a lot of religious holidays in our company, and we respect that. So we know during Ramadan our workers can't work at certain periods of time. Or if you have Hasidic Jews inside of your company, they have certain parameters of when they can work and when they cannot work when they're celebrating their holidays. So you have to actually look at cultural influences in this as well, because they all cause downtimes. And one of the big goals is looking at this risk is reducing those downtimes to make sure that your scope and your schedule is manageable. Reducing these workforce labor issues and stresses is an influence on the top that can help you be more productive in your whole project management plan. Any little bump can cause a wave inside of your actual project. I kind of hate that analogy of throwing a pebble into a pond. As it grows across the pond, the wave can get bigger and bigger and bigger and build influence. So you have to think about those things. If you have a union issue to where people don't feel that they're being treated correctly and they go to their labor officials, the labor officials can have an ultimate workflow stoppage in one department or an entire department or in the entire organization if you're working with union contracts overall, and they could strike. You have to think about ways to make sure your workforce labor stress factors are reduced to make sure work is continued in your business continuity plan, which is a part and an element inside the overall projects. It's a whole other degree of building inside these plans and assessment value. A lot of people like to look at risk on tolerance, and there's sort of 3 different tiers that most companies will have built into their schematics for their project managers. And they look at the tolerance levels as adverse risk, how low will the tolerance and acceptability to accepting a risk is your organization. Every organization has a very different level for these, and you have to understand this. This is a weighted situation in most cases, and there's parameters put in place by senior management to understand that tolerance level. There's a risk neutral, which a lot of companies try to balance this idea in their scorecard to making sure that they're balancing the amount of risk is equal to the payoffs, or the payoffs are slightly greater, but they're not having much risk at all. There's a lot of companies out there that are risk seeking, and they're willing to take on the risks for higher tolerance, with higher tolerances, so they can get bigger outcomes. You can set these up on the old-fashioned Y and X axis and draw a line, and if you do this by weight, you can write up and down the level according to your weights through 100, or you can do it by putting an actual numeric value and drawing from 0 to whatever on the y-axis to where you feel that your company is going to get an action out of this that's pleasurable and they're willing to accept versus the opportunity that they're willing to take for the payoff. And when you create this axis, it gives you a point for your company's tolerance points where the two axes meet. It's kind of a simplistic economic value of looking at risk tolerance for your company and organization. And again, that can be done quantitatively with exact numbers or qualitatively by discussions with your team and your senior management to saying about each individual risk. How much are they willing to risk labor breakdown by forcing people to work overtime to get a job done faster. These are some factors that you'd have to think about. Planning risk is one of the things that a lot of junior project managers don't like to do, because it's taking a lot of time and effort to first try to really look at and identify and register every single known aspect that could be a risk, and then essentially prioritizing these risks and weighting them into a scaled version. You can do it anywhere from 1 to 100 to 1 to 10, or whatever value you place on it. You can even do A, B, C, doesn't really matter. It's kind of a qualitative risk management system to where you're observing and weighting these actions or discussing them personally, and everyone puts an influence on it. They could do it in percentage values and influence values. They could say, for instance, buying new hardware, or waiting out buying new hardware before you start a project. You can place a percentage of risk on this. If everything's functioning right and you've had no problems with any of your equipment, then you can say, well, we have a low risk assessment of that qualitative. Maybe we'll say it's a 20% risk and put a numeric value and move it into a quantitative style of doing this, or low, medium, high. Versus if you have a lot of old equipment that's prone to being problem and errors happening all the times, or needing software, knowing that you need software upgraded, you may want to reassess this, as it's a higher risk that needs to be looked at before you take on a project. The idea of this whole thing is creating a plan for response, and the response being, one, can we accept this risk? Can we take on this job, this work, this contract? And once you're inside of it, having a systematic method at milestones or in between markers to monitor these risks and make sure they're not escalating beyond what you prepared for them to be. And if there is a risk escalation, looking at your plan that you've developed prior to how do you understand and how you're going to strategically minimize or mitigate this risk that's being elevated. We can say this a lot of times by human capital. I like to go back to, because this is a lot of the gray areas where you never know what's going to happen. If you're in flu season and flu strikes one person, that person comes into work and spreads it to 4 people, now you have a whole department. Maybe it spreads to 50 people. You have a whole floor inside your organization that's down because of the flu. You have to think about this. How can you monitor this risk? Can you set up plans for people if they are feeling sick or getting cold to work at home? Set up so that they automatically understand that there's systems where you have to wash your hands every time you get up. If you touch anybody else's phones, you have to make sure you notify them. Can you put in small items such as hand wipes so that they constantly wipe computer screens when you come in if there's a shift change? Can you put in, right outside of all the water coolers and areas, fresh glasses, plastic glasses to be thrown away, so glasses aren't being tossed down and reused by anyone accidentally that shares germs? These are all ways to look at and create a response plan for something in human capital, such as a flu. This does happen, especially working with big teams in tight areas with small airflow. Maybe it's installing a bigger airflow system to help stop and prevent germs. These are all things that you have to think about. This is just one scenario and kind of a way to plan that risk and engage in a strategic mitigation plan. Contingency business planning is really what we're thinking about here when we think about assessing the risks. We're putting out that what happens idea. It's a plan for your business continuing if something happens prior to it, and mitigating the risks that it would take to have a work stoppage or a shutdown or an accident. Think about this. We all do what? Backup drives. Maybe we buy an extra piece of hardware and have it in storage, so that if a computer does go down and is affected, we just simply take out the machine, move it back, and let the employee go back to work. We're talking now an hour's worth of stoppage versus, who knows, a week. Maybe we do a backup on a third-party vendor that we use to make sure that all our work is stored outside of our facility in case of a fire. If you have a fire, what happens? Well, can you go to another center? Do you have a plan for relocating your workforce? Do you have a plan to share office space with another department? These are all things you'd have to think about in your mitigation plan. And this goes into more disaster recovery ideas, but there's also ways to think about this just as relocation centers if you have a large group of individuals getting sick. Maybe you move to another side of the building. Can you share platforms? Can you get people away that are not sick? What about stress reduction plans for staff? When you're working with high stress and coding and all these different aspects in our IT field, you have to think about methods for just reducing staff stress. Stress is an issue that can cause sickness, can cause mental illness, can cause frustration, can cause, more importantly, key people to leave your company and go somewhere else if they're very unhappy. Think about therapy dogs today. I know you're kind of probably giggling right now, but therapy dogs are something that's a very incredible resource that a lot of companies are using. The university, for example, is using them during finals time when students are really stressed out here on campus. There's usually 2 or 3 therapy dogs brought in. They walk around campus, they go to the library, and that little bit of time that the student takes to just pet the dog, get a smile, get a lick on the face, reduces all that stress buildup inside of the person. Maybe you go with Raymond Shea Zappos ideas, allowing people the freedom to bring their dog into work, to wear a clown suit if you really want to have an hour of Facebook time built into the day to where everyone can go and just do what they need. Think about life's parameters, allowing people to have the freedom to go and do online banking, online whatever, checking in with their children, building that time frame in there every day in the workforce, allowing everybody to have that freedom of a half an hour, 40 minutes. That would reduce the exterior forces, the secondary causes that cause a workforce, labor, stress. Think about a crisis communication plan would be built into your project management. What happens and who do you report to in a crisis? Say the president dies. What would you do? How would you handle this? Who's now in charge? What happens if there's a fire and everybody's evacuated from the building? Is there a person in charge of doing head counts? Is that your supervisor? Is that the project manager? Who's the person that coordinates information to the stakeholders and to the president to make sure that they understand the full ramifications of a fire if it happened? What happened to the building, the structure, the hardware, the software, the planning that you were doing right now? These are all things that would go into your crisis communication plan, and that would be in your charter as well as who you report to in a crisis. You'd want to have that up front for everybody on your team. These are all risks to business continuity, and I say this and I bring this up now because this is a large portion of project management, of understanding all these risks, and they can be anything. A power outage can set back a company for anything from an hour to a month. If a transformer is blown up and you have to bring in a transformer and you're at the mercy of an electric company to come in, it might take a while. If there's a hurricane or a tornado, it might take weeks to get the workforce back up just from a power outage. Same with a fire. Cyber attacks is a constant thing in IT that we're worried about and looking at. Deaths of key stakeholders, deaths of key people inside of your employee round on the team. You never know what's going to happen. Maybe one of their family members passes away. You have to allow for time for that to happen for them to grieve. Today we live in a world of terrorism. Unfortunately, this happens. How do you have a plan to deal with that? To reduce the stress, to get the workforce safely back into your organization. It's a whole thought process of externalities of these actions that you have to think about, and I'll talk about those second stage externalities in a minute. But we can look at the risk in a couple different parameters. The market risk is always something that can happen in these things. Will it cause project failure? If you're down for 2 months or 2 years because of all this, think about electric cars today. Every single company out there now is building electric cars, newer and faster, able to drive longer, more effective. What if your project that you're building on is GM's newest car and you go down? You lose the ability. You lose your contracts. You lose the government support. How could you sustain that? How could you move forward? Tesla was going right by you. These are all things that are out there that you have to think about. The financial risk of that project. Is the payoff actually going to be in the scope of what you thought it was going to be? What if you're doing a buyout? What if your company projects it would be cheaper and better to buy a third-party company and integrate them in, but during this they didn't realize the paybacks are not actually what they're going to get? Maybe the third-party company cooked their books for the sale, overestimated the amount of money that they were bringing in. How would you deal with this as a financial risk? Technology is always a risk. You never know what's going to happen to hardware or software. Your network can go down. You never know if lightning's going to hit and cause a problem with the hardware as well. You get a bug. You get malware. It only takes one, oh my God, look at this. Click. And now email is attacked. Human capital risks are always out there. I love to say that when you're hiring people and the rules, that their HR role is fit for the needs that you have, but a lot of times you don't have a person that's qualified for the role. HR misinformed you, or they didn't get the right information, so you have to build in training time for this person. So that's a risk you have to think about. Can you sustain training a person that you've hired to keep them up to speed or getting them where they need to be? A lot of these things can be evaluated on a SWOT analysis. I like doing these for my personal self all the time, for my teams, for everything I'm doing. I constantly look at these. I say, what's my strengths right now? What are my current weaknesses? What are the opportunities we have, and what are the threats? I like to be able to take the opportunities and threats and move them into strengths, or the weaknesses, find opportunities to move them into a strength. And a lot of times I think of this as human capital, and I'll say, well, if I have that person in labor who needs more training and time, what if I team them up with a senior person and let them be a mentor to them? So now the weakness becomes kind of an opportunity because it's building more strengths in my leadership abilities and individual team members. It also creates relationships, downs the threats of me not being able to get things done because they learn on the job. It costs me less. I don't have to take time to have somebody paid to train the person. And it builds a greater relationship in my team and strengthens everything overall. So I always look for ways to mentor people. That's one way I work through that process of strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats in a team. A lot of people like to use the quantitative analysis and decision tree models. It's a way to estimate the actual probability of an occurrence and putting a numeric value to this. In most cases, when you're trying to calculate the expected monetary value, you want to assess the risk and you want to place an actual value and a percentage onto this. And you simply take that and the outcome value, what you think the profitability will be of the actual project, and then you times it. So if we have, say, training is going to take us 20% of the cost that we have inside of the whole program to get everybody up to building code the way we need it to happen, and we're expecting to make $200,000, you can say a probability is 20% to get your expected monetary value. So you're looking at $40,000 out of the expected outcome value as a loss. So now you're looking at $160,000 outcome value of taking on a project. So this is, it's different ways to look at things quickly and assess just by you doing a weighted value, which I kind of like to do. But more importantly, it helps you look at this risk responses, so you can think about doing this. And if you have something like the training aspect you come up and it's going to be too costly, how can you avoid that? Can you set up a mentoring program prior to starting the positions? Can you eliminate the job overall? Unfortunately, it's something that happens in the workforce today. And rehire. Can you stop the hiring process if you're inside of a group of team people looking at hiring a person? Can you say no hire? Or should you accept this risk and accept the consequences of hiring the individual who's not quite up to par, but you know that they have great potential to be a great employee, and put that time and investment money into them and or mentoring ability into them. You can look at risk transference, which a lot of companies are doing today with third-party responsibilities. You can say, well, we need backup on all of our data. We don't want to invest in another data mart, so why don't we take it to a third-party cloud and have them be responsible for a continuous backup, something like COBOL is doing for us. And I work with a company called Carbonite to back up everything that I do. And it's a continuous backup that cycles through my computer every single minute it's on. As soon as it's on, it's backing everything up. These are different ways to do transference. That risk mitigation is, ideas of thinking about using these third-party backups, reducing the impacts if something does happen. Not only having a backup for the third party, but having a backup plan for yourself in the office. Maybe you have a drive you take home all your work on every day and just copy it before you leave. The residual risks are those remaining after your strategy's been implemented. So what happens if you do a backup and you take a backup drive with you? There's always this secondary risks that happen. Maybe you end up in a car crash on the way home and your drive gets stolen. Maybe you're walking out and your drive is in your briefcase and you get mocked. These things can happen. These are all influences and things you have to think about a little bit. What happens if you take your backup drive home and there's a house fire? What happens if there's a tornado and you live close to your building, your organization is wiped out and so is your house? These things can happen. They're the secondary consequences of risk. I like to look at it the third-party vendor idea because everybody wants to jump to that today. When you look at a third-party vendor, you're looking at security measures that they have, not you have. Are they actually protected from cyber attacks for protecting your data? What happens if they get broken into? Think about Target and some of these other places we've seen. Think about how this is actually a problem for them because they have no control of the security measures that are implemented by a third-party vendor. And at any time, a third-party vendor can change their policies and their mitigation plans for risk. You have no control over this. That's a secondary consequence risk. The same happens what if their business goes out of business? How are you going to get your data that they have? Who's going to say that it's still protected? What if they sell all of their equipment and your data has been stored on there? How do you know that it hasn't been already stricken? How do you know that they have wiped the data clean? How do you know if they donate old computers to Goodwill or some other place that your data is not already on there and someone can simply grab the hard drives and recapture it? What happens if they have a human capital risk, espionage inside of their business? Say one of your competitors find out that you're using a third-party vendor and they decide that, well, the best way is let's put one of our people inside of their third-party vendors. Let's get them hired and they steal the data from them. These are all things that can happen, and it has happened and will continue to happen, and they're part of your risk plan that you have to think about in your project management aspects. A lot of this is interesting, and it's delved into more disaster recovery, but I wanted you guys to have a thought process for looking at this and how to weight risk and think about risk and building it into the plan, and even looking at a plan to decide whether or not we should take the plan on. We should take the project on. We should tackle this job. Or we should pass. Gang, I hope you enjoyed this one. It's a little different thought process, and it got you into the idea of thinking about secondary consequences of taking on projects, taking on risk, and seeing what happens. We can do this to apply this to our everyday life. Hope you have a great day. Get out there. It's sunny today, I think. So if it is, make sure you go out, ride a bike, go for a walk, throw a baseball with your son or daughter, do something interesting, play with your dog. Life isn't all about academics, gang. Have a great day.